chapter 5. We talked about Jesus being interrupted last week, and we saw how sometimes there are times in our lives where we feel like maybe we've been put on pause, or maybe we've been set aside. Maybe it seems like God started to do something and He stopped, and we kind of looked a little bit at that. Now we're going to continue with Jairus' story. We're going to look at the entire thing, and we're going to read the entire account again, simply so that we don't lose that sense of that interruption, because that interruption, that feeling of the interruption is amplified by the next thing that happens in this event. And when we're looking at this, particularly if we're trying to look at it from Jairus' point of view, that interruption is important, and it plays into one of the things that Jesus is going to say that is really should be impactful for all of us. So we're going to begin once again in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, "If I touch his clothing, I'll be made well." Instantly her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. So, Jairus is a typical parent, and he, when his daughter got deathly ill, he decided to seek out Jesus. We don't know if he sought out doctors like the woman with the bleeding issue did. We don't know if there were other things he had tried. All we know is that he knew where to find Jesus. He went to Jesus, and he had this expectation that Jesus would be able to do something. But then of course we had that interruption, right? So Jesus is on his way. Jairus is probably feeling pretty good, and then you have that interruption where Jesus stops to deal with something else. And honestly, from Jairus' perspective, probably something that could have been dealt with at any other time. Why interrupt this important work for this woman? She's been bleeding for 12 years. She can wait a little longer from his perspective. But what Jesus does, he stops and deals with that, and right afterwards, some people came from Jairus' house and said, she's gone, your daughter is dead, so we don't need to bother the teacher anymore. Whether that was out of respect for Jesus that they were saying this, or whether they were some of the religious leaders who didn't believe in Jesus, and so they were trying to talk Jairus out of trusting Jesus any further, and maybe this was their way of saying, see, all this stuff you've heard about Jesus, it can't be true. We don't know. We're not given much. All we know is they came and said, your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? And this is where Jesus makes that statement of, he overheard it, right? He overheard it, and he turns to Jairus and says, don't be afraid, only believe. Don't be afraid, only believe. And that, I think, is something that we all need to take into consideration. I think that's a phrase that we all can apply, is Jesus says, don't be afraid, only believe. Why? Because life is full of things that make us afraid. And this father's love for his daughter, of course, it would have. I believe fear was a part of what he was acting out of. And it's a natural thing. And when Jesus says don't fear, he's not saying that it was inappropriate for Jairus to be concerned about his daughter. He's simply saying, don't give in to the feeling that everything is hopeless. Don't give in to the idea that they're coming to you and saying to you that there's no more hope because your daughter is dead. Why? Well, because one of the realities that we face here is things are not always as they appear. Now, in the daughter's case, was she dead? Yes. And we have to struggle with verse 39, where he goes in and all the people are making a commotion. He makes a comment, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but asleep. And she was obviously dead. People in the ancient world, and even people in many places today, they know death so well that they can spot the death. They can tell when someone's dead and when they've just gone into a comatose state. Some people have suggested that this little girl just went into a coma. She wasn't actually dead. However, a couple of problems with that. Number one, like I said, people back then know death. They knew it. These wailers, quite honestly, they're professional weepers and professional mourners, and a lot of times, and particularly people who could afford it would hire people to come, these professional mourners, to come and make this commotion, because it deepens the mourning experience. It helps when there's a crowd mourning for something. And so Jairus, being a synagogue leader, he probably had a lot of friends and family and others who were there as well. So this crowd was probably a mixture, but there were probably these professional mourners who would have understood death and all that, but that's why they could immediately turn around and start laughing. And that's where we get the idea that these aren't just people actually mourning, because it's kind of a superficial mourning if you can start mocking somebody in the middle of it. There's this sense of, what are you talking about? No, you go away, let us do our job. Going on here. So that's problem number one with thinking that the girl wasn't actually dead, is there was several people around who somebody in the crowd, either a professional mourner, because they see this all the time, this is what they do, the friends, the ones closest to the girl. It doesn't mention the girl's mother, but we can assume the girl's mother probably stayed with the girl while Jairus went in to get Jesus. Several people, somebody would have, if in Lord of the Rings, where Denethor, the Steward of Gondor, thinks his son is dead, and he goes into this crazy little maniacal thing, but Pippin recognizes the fact he's still alive. The son's not dead. Somebody would have played Pippin's role here, and gone around saying, hey, she's still alive, but nobody did. Second thing is, if you read Luke's account of this, it states quite plainly that she was dead. And it even states when Jesus raises her again that her spirit re-entered her body. So it's obvious. Even Jesus was aware she was dead. So why would he say this? It's because he understood what was about to happen. Now, when I say things are not always as they appear, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's like, sometimes somebody looks dead and they're not, Princess Bride type situation where, I don't know so much. It just so happens your friend here is only mostly dead. So, sometimes that happens, where things they look completely convincing, but there's something we don't know. And so things aren't always as they appear that way. Or it's, from Jesus' perspective, he knew what he was about to do. Now, to the grand majority of these people, they probably have heard stories from the Old Testament and the miracles that took place, even the miracles of people being raised from the dead, but they've probably never seen it before. And for most people, including us, death seems to be a completely, permanent situation. You don't come back from that. Or do you? Things are not always as they appear. Things are not always as permanent as they appear. And even though we look at it as permanent, the reality is, history has several incidents recorded in the Bible that are true and believable of people coming back from the dead. There are other stories throughout history of people coming back from the dead. There are even stories today about people being raised from the dead. And while I'm a little skeptical of many such stories because it is a little odd, there are some that the evidence seems to suggest that yes, it occasionally happens. But not only that, but throughout the Bible, there's always this expectation at the end of time, the dead will rise. See, it seems so permanent to us because when somebody in our life dies, we don't see them in this life again. Because most of us have probably never experienced the miracle of somebody being brought back to life. And so it's easy to not believe. Now, you see, Jairus would be in the position when somebody came and said, hey, your daughter is dead. He would be in the position to automatically just assume it's over. But Jesus reminds him, hey, things are not always as they seem, as they appear. It's not necessarily over just because it looks like it's over. Don't be afraid. Only believe. And so Jesus says that in this context in order to tell Jairus, don't give in to fear. Don't give in. Fear is one of those reactions. It's normal, and you can't always help it, and you don't always want to help it because some fear is healthy, some fear is good, some fear is definitely useful. However, it's I heard recently this saying that emotions are real, but they're not reliable. In other words, you don't let the emotions drive the bus. Inside Out's a great little movie. Inside Out 2. I enjoy those, and they're cute. They're wonderful, and I think there's a lot of really good things in there. Even if there are some things that you kind of from our worldview perspective, you might go, well, just a minute. Well, I think overall that there's very positive messaging in there. But remember, it's a kids show. It's a kids movie. The reality is, don't let emotions drive the bus. I mean, we kind of even see it in the movies. What happens? I mean, things go absolutely berserk when the emotions are all trying to drive the bus. They need to put another character in there that's not an emotion, but more of a willful, intentional control. Because you are more than just emotions. Emotions are gauges. It's like gauges on your car. They tell you things. They respond to things. When the little light pops on, it tells you, hey, I popped on because of this. It draws your attention to something. But you got to be careful. Like just the other morning, the little tire pressure light came on in our car, and the tire pressure was fine. It's just it had been a cold morning, and so the sensor was reading a little off, and the tires were a little, because if you know anything about air temperature and pressure inside things, as temperature changes, your tire pressure is going to change. It was fine. It was perfectly normal. But what did it do? It got me to check the pressures. It got me to look and see, but I didn't automatically pull over and change the tire. You don't let those things dictate. They give you information, you process that information, and you act according to what you've processed. You don't just let the emotion dictate. You don't let the emotion control. Same here. He says, don't be afraid, only believe. Don't give in to fear, trust me. And ultimately what Jesus is really saying is exactly what we need to say, what we need to hear. And that is this: trust Jesus more than yourself. And by yourself, I mean, there's so much that goes into that, because, and I really debated how much, how to phrase this is, because you want to trust Jesus more than your senses. Your senses are good. And don't discount your senses. I'm not saying throw reason out the window. Because I've heard some sermons where that's exactly what they're saying, even if they don't say that. It's like, I don't care what you've seen, heard, felt, whatever. If it doesn't align exactly with what I'm saying, then it's wrong. And sometimes maybe that's true, but the reality is, don't throw your senses out the window, because it is very sensible. What Jesus is asking Jairus to do is sensible, because we've already seen him perform many miracles. We've already seen him. As a matter of fact, Jairus saw him perform a miracle for the woman, fascinatingly enough, and I haven't really figured out what the connection here is. But this woman suffered for bleeding for 12 years, according to verse 25. You get down here to verse 42, immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. Interesting. So when this woman started bleeding, about the same time as the girl was born, it's almost like this was an orchestrated event. The God knew way beforehand what was going to happen. He timed everything so that this would play out exactly this way. How could we do that? I mean, some people are very good at planning and long-term planning, and some people are great at long-term manipulation. If you watch Star Wars movies, Palpatine seems to be the ultimate at this, because he plays every game there is to make sure he wins. Up to and including, apparently, in the sequels, cloning himself and coming back from the dead, just randomly. However you feel about that, zero relevant to this, but he's a good example of someone who can plan. But even he can't plan every little detail out like this to make one event absolutely certain to happen at a specific time, just as Jesus happens to be walking in the right place. It really gives the sense that this was something that God had planned out all along. And if God can plan things out like that, he's really saying he's far more trustworthy than we are, than our senses are, because things are not always as they appear. He's far more trustworthy than our emotions, because our emotions are real, but they're not always reliable. But he is real and reliable. And what about all these professionals? What about all the doctors that the woman went to see, and possibly the girl? We don't know, but we know the woman went to see doctors. What about all these professional mourners? And what about the people who took care of the dead bodies? What about all these professionals? He's not discounting them. He's not saying that they're worthless. He's not saying, these people have no place in your life. What he's saying, though, is he's more trustworthy than they are, because they're human and they can make mistakes, or they're human and their knowledge is very limited. And which is what I think the case for the doctors and the woman particularly is their knowledge was very limited. They we can look back now and kind of laugh at their medical practices, but if we were to go back in time and erase what we know and then just know what they know, they probably were doing a fine job by their standards. But we know now that, they didn't know everything they needed to know to help the woman. God's more reliable than our professionals, more reliable than our friends. Doesn't mean that our friends aren't reliable. It just means God's more. None of this discounts anybody else. As a matter of fact, it elevates everybody. But it really elevates Jesus and shows us our need for him. Is because nothing wrong with the man having called the mourners, nothing wrong with having people come and be there with the little girl, nothing wrong with any of that. But he didn't need to let that be the entirety of the story. He needed to trust Jesus. And indeed, we see that he did. He went to Jesus to begin with, and when everybody said, hey, she's dead, don't bother the teacher anymore, and Jesus said, don't be afraid, only believe. He took Jesus, he went forward with it. He did what he needed to do. He demonstrated that faith. And that made all the difference. And so the long and the short of what Jesus is really getting at here is I think he'd tell us the same thing. Don't be afraid, only believe. Whatever it is that we're afraid of, whatever it is in our life that seems like it's going to overwhelm us, or that it seems like it has overwhelmed us, or it seems like there's no way out of this, there's no hope for this, whatever that is in your life, Jesus is saying, don't be afraid, only believe. Don't give in to that fear, and trust him more than you trust yourself. Don't think that just because you can't fix the problem automatically means the problem can't be fixed. Because Jesus, would tell his disciples, with humanity, with humans, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And it boils down to, do we believe that? Do we believe that all things are possible for God? And sometimes it seems like he's not answering our prayers. Sometimes it seems like he's not bringing a resolution. Just like for Jairus. He went, he got Jesus, and then he got interrupted. And that had to have been frustrating. And then when he found out his daughter was dead, maybe there was a moment that said, if we wouldn't have stopped, if this woman wouldn't have interrupted us, if she would have just, kept her hands to herself. But what he discovered was, even when it seemed like it was completely hopeless, when it was over, there was still hope. And it's not a false hope, okay? It's, we pray for sick people. They don't always get well. But does that mean that it's over? Even if they don't get raised from the dead now or in our lifetime, doesn't mean that it's over. We've already seen how God plays the long game. We've seen how Jesus plays the long game. We see how the entirety of history is God's long game. Sometimes the true test of faith is not in God giving us what we want in our lifetime. Sometimes the true test of faith is believing even to our death that God will resolve it all. I believe it was George Mueller. George Mueller was known as man of prayer. 19th century London. He operated little orphanages, operated on faith. And there's a lot of great stories of his prayers and his faith and how God came through in his lifetime. But I believe he's the one that also had 3 friends that he prayed for every day that they would come to know Jesus. His entire life he prayed. For decades he prayed. And he died without those 3 coming to know Jesus. But later, they all 3 did. After his death. As a matter of fact, the way he faced death and the faith that he had in the face of his own mortality is part of what convinced them. So God answered his prayer. It was just after his lifetime. And what about the prayers that we seem to think we need in this lifetime? Well, we have to trust that there is a resolution. That there will be a resolution. Even if it means at the end of time, we believe there is a resolution. And that's really what Jesus is getting at, is trust. The long and the short of it is trust Jesus. And trust his solution. It may be the same solution that he gave to Jairus. It might be a miracle in your life. It might be the same as the woman, a miracle. Or it might not be. It might be like George Mueller or countless others who've prayed for something and died without receiving it, but they still had faith. And you can go to Hebrews 11, you can see Hebrews talks about this. It talks about those who believed in something even though they didn't receive it. And they realized that the reason they didn't receive what they were after is because God had something better for those who would follow, so that all, including those who have passed away, will have the best in the end. And so today, whatever it is that you're facing, I think that's what Jesus would say, is don't be afraid, only believe. And sometimes one of the greatest gifts that our faith can give us is that comfort of being able to stand firm and hold fast and believe no matter what the outcome is. There's a comfort and a contentment that comes when we can surrender and trust Jesus more than we trust ourselves. When we can trust that he truly does have our best interests at heart. And when we can trust that his end is better than any end we could come up with. And so, don't be afraid. Don't fear. Only believe. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we do come before you. We thank you for this day and this opportunity to come together. We do pray, Lord, that you would help us with this whole concept of don't be afraid, only believe. When life throws things our way, when we feel crushed, when we feel burdened, oppressed, saddened, whatever, it's very difficult to not give in to the fear and the sense of hopelessness and helplessness. But we thank you that even in the midst of those feelings, we can turn to you. And that with compassion you tell us, don't fear, only believe. Help us to overcome our fear. Help us to trust you more than we trust ourselves, more than we trust our senses, more than we trust anything else or anyone else. Give us true faith. And I pray, Father, that whatever challenges or obstacles we face, I pray, Lord, that you would see the best outcome happen. I thank you. I praise you. I thank you that we can trust you in all things. And I thank you that we know that in the end, all things will be resolved according to your good and perfect will. So help us to hold on to our faith as you work that out. Help us to trust you and help us to spread your message to others who need the hope that you can provide. So we thank you and we praise you. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.